Well, last week it was a bit of a lefty love fest when Jacinda Ardern did a 5-day tour of Australia. But the speech at the Lowy Institute in Sydney was enlightening, to say the least. Here's a reminder.
It would also be wrong to position the Pacific in such a way that they have to pick sides.
Now, even the most neutral of neutral European states like Finland, Sweden and Switzerland are finally taking a stand on China. So how does Jacinda Ardern explain her new foreign policy ambiguity? Joining me now, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson and Nick Cater, who's written brilliantly in The Australian on this issue, saying that if Ardern's speech was a genuine reflection of a country's foreign policy, we're in trouble. Gentlemen, welcome. I don't know where to start on New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern. I mean, this idea that New Zealanders can vote in Australia, that's her push. They get our welfare, that's her push. That we keep their criminals, that's her push. This foreign policy stuff, it's dangerous, Nick.
It is, Peter. This is where it really gets worrying. I mean, the most important thing we need against China now is firm unity between like-minded countries that believe in freedom and that are opposed to, a tyrannical regime like the Chinese one pushing itself on its neighbours. And I think for Jacinda Ardern to say, well, we can't tell sovereign nations what to do, as if to say, that we're not going to force them to choose between China and the West, is just absolutely irresponsible. And it seems to me that the speech she gave last week on Thursday, she'd given deliberately in order to appease the Chinese, because the Chinese had been making hostile noises ever since she made a surprisingly feisty declaration on the Solomon Islands. And this is deadly scary. And to see New Zealand go this way should worry us all.
She was very weak on China when we were calling for an investigation into the origins of COVID. You remember that, Nick. They had just concluded a big free trade agreement. They're heavily dependent on dairy. They got into the dairy deal with China before we completed our FTA. So they were sort of kowtowing, I think, in some of the language on China. It was an incredible speech with incredible sort of lines all the way through it, but I think none more incredible, if I use that word advisedly, than this one.
Climate change must be a foreign policy priority. While we all have a concern, and rightly so, about any moves towards militarisation of our region, that must surely be matched by a concern for those who experience the violence of climate change.
Now, there's a violence of climate change rubbish, John Anderson. We're actually seeing it play out in Sri Lanka, where they've gone all green on their agricultural policies. They've got no food for their people, no food to export. This is the real violence of climate change.
Well, I find it very hard to believe that a Prime Minister of a serious country can be so naive, frankly. And she is now starting to impact on agricultural production. There will be taxes on food production. But you might have a look at Holland in Europe, where their government has now decided to limit in the same, not to the same extent, but to do the same thing that happened in Sri Lanka, to start to reduce the availability and the right to use artificial fertiliser at a time when we're already facing a food catastrophe. So you're going to ask people to choose between feeding themselves and feeding the disadvantaged and the less well-off when we've made such tremendous progress and bad climate change. Well, it's a no-brainer for me. It's time we called this stuff out and people stopped thinking so emotively about this stuff and started to think in terms of hard reality.
Let's go to the issue of the Waragamba Dam and mitigation, the increase to the wall. The Albanese government says they're going to look into it. The New South Wales Labor leader, Chris Minns, says he's not going to raise the wall and he's probably odds-on favourite to win the election in March. The Peta government, well, they're not making a commitment either way. Today reports too about concerns regarding Aboriginal heritage sites in the area. So even if there's a will to do it, I suspect it'll be tied up in courts and environmental approvals for years and years and years. I mean, Nick, surely we've got to be able to do better than this.
Absolutely. I think the failure to move quickly and raise the height of the Waragamba Dam when it was clear that it needed to be done has had terrible consequences in these most recent floods. There are so many properties and so many low-lying areas downstream from the dam which would not have been flooded if there was sensible a decision had been made to raise the wall of the dam. And, OK, so there's a bit of, forest up there, there's a bit of, maybe there are some Aboriginal sacred sites, etc., but we have to make trade-offs. And if we think it's OK to let the water overflow and flood large areas and ruin people's lives, and we think that's OK, then then it's something wrong with us. And we've got a desalination plant built here in 2007 when we started to panic because the dam had reached a third of its capacity. Surely the decision then should have been, let's raise the thing, and then we can do both flood mitigation and we can store water for those times when we need it.
Yeah.
John, I've got to ask you, over in the UK, the Church of England have come out to say that there's actually no definition of a woman. There's no official definition of a woman. This is not a radical organisation. This is not a left-wing organisation. This is something as fundamental as a big Christian church. How concerned are you?
Well, I am concerned. I think it denies both biology and what the Bible has to say. And I suspect, actually, that you may be being optimistic. I have a feeling that the Church of England has been well and truly, if you like, infiltrated by people who are trying to accommodate the culture, and then they wonder why the pews are empty. Well, at a time of enormous confusion, I actually think people are much more attracted to faith when that faith is distinctive and timeless, not faddish.
Nick Cater, I don't know who they think they're going to win over, all of these activists on this issue, because women of the left and women of the right that I speak to are only getting angrier and angrier here.
Yeah, I don't know why the Conservatives didn't stand up right away at the start of this debate and say, sorry, we're not talking about this. We know what a woman is. We know what a man is. And that's where the debate ends. But I think it's the equivocation and wanting to have a bob each way by Conservatives, and here in the church the same thing's happening. That's what's going to lose us this argument.
I hate to report, if I walked into the Coalition Party room when Parliament returns in a couple of weeks' time and polled everyone sitting there just recently elected, there'd be plenty of people sitting on the fence right now, Nick Cater, and you know that I'm right. Yeah, there would be people sitting on the fence, and that's what shames me as a Liberal. You can disagree, but I think I'm right, aren't I, Nick?
Well, look, I do agree with you, Peter.
Right.
I don't know why. This is one of those things. Why should anybody be confused on this issue? It's so obvious.
Well, the research, by the way,
and it
if the
shames
Liberal Party
women.
believes in polling and research, they'd know that the Australian people are very clear on this one. They are very clear on it.
Spot on, John. I'll see you next week, gentlemen. Thank you.